Welcome everyone, and thanks again for downloading another episode to the 7 Minutes to Midnight series. For this episode, we're going to focus on the stay behind concept. Now, Colin and I have an understanding of this role with regards to us involved in fighting the deep battle, using mainly UK, but also some NATO long-range strike capabilities. However, the stay behind concept and the way it operated behind enemy lines across NATO, across all the different nations that were involved, was far more than that little group that I knew. This concept was used extensively during World War II. And what we found is many of the tactics and techniques that were used in the Cold War were developed during the Second World War and were used through towards the early 90s, especially in our old unit.
Our guest for this episode is Tamir Sinai, and I came across his work last year in a paper titled Eyes on Target, Stay Behind Forces During the Cold War. And this examines the concept as a warfighting tactic used by NATO to maximise its defensive efforts against a possible Soviet onslaught during the Cold War. It's online, and I'll put a link in the show notes so you can access it later. Tamir discusses the concept and describes the military and clandestine units involved, how they operated, the type of task carried out, and the scale of resources NATO nations devoted to this concept. So Tamir, welcome as our guest in the Cold War episode.
Thanks for having me.
What drew you to this subject, and how difficult was it to research, as I'm sure that a number of the organisations mentioned are not very open about their roles past and present?
Well, what drew me to the subject is general interest, obviously, in special forces operations. I myself am a para officer and was involved in a little bit of that. What was remarkable, though, is, and that is common to any research and intelligence study, is that how difficult it is to research these things, even after 50, 60, 70 years later. The US, for example, declassifies documents much earlier than the UK does and publishes them online. Which is obviously a great help. As a researcher, you then have to kind of join the dots and deduce from what is available and build on that. With regards to the clandestine stay-behind efforts, there were a couple of commissions of inquiry conducted at the end of the Cold War in different countries, and those are obviously also a good source of information. The clandestine aspects of stay-behind have, over time, drawn a lot of attention, especially in the 90s when the scandalous use of NATO's secret army, as it was then called, was published. The term Operation Gladio, coined by a Swiss conspiracy theorist and pseudoscientist, I would say, became the tabloidy way to describe everything connected to stay behind. Since then, obviously, more serious research has been conducted. My article particularly aimed at providing the often ignored role of military units, such as your old unit, and the role they played in the overall NATO war plans. Stay behind was and is a war-fighting tactic, and it was fully incorporated into NATO defense plans for Western Europe. It is still being taught and used in conflicts today.
Post-World War II, why did NATO adopt the stay-behind concept? As I mentioned at the beginning, it was very much a Second World War concept used in occupied Europe. Why did NATO think this was a capability they required as well?
Well, we need to remember that NATO faced in Europe a numerically superior adversary. The commanders at NATO commands, such as NORTHAC, the Northern Army Group in West Germany, desperately needed to gain accurate and timely intelligence on, first and foremost, Warsaw Pact mobilization and movements before the outbreak of hostilities, hopefully. It had to gain the necessary time to deploy forces to their frontline positions and mobilize reservists from the UK and obviously from the US. You remember the big exercises, Lionheart and Reforger, that were conducted on a regular basis to train this reinforcement of the front line in Western Germany. So at the early stages of the war, the assumption was that Warsaw Pact advances would be much too swift to rely on only air reconnaissance and signal intelligence. So special forces were envisioned to be the eyes and ears of NATO, reporting on troop concentrations, identifying the main thrust of the Warsaw Pact attack their supply routes, locations of reserves, logistic supply dumps, and so on and so forth. So NATO's special forces were then tasked with guiding air, missile, and nuclear strikes against these high-priority targets, delaying and retarding the advancing Warsaw Pact forces, and by that, buying time for NATO to really reinforce the defenses further west. In the 1950s, the main line of defense would have been the River Rhine, far into Germany.
We're talking about the 50s, 60s, 70s. I think what a lot of the audience who are a little bit younger than perhaps me and Colin are, they don't realise that there was no social media, there was no mobile phones. Signals, intelligence was more rudimentary than it has ever been, in comparison to today. And we've talked about this before. The man on the ground, the eyes on target was then, and probably still is, the best means of identifying a target, interrogating it, and bringing weapon systems to bear.
I think as well, Kev and I have both talked about Exercise Lionheart and Reforger and the sheer size of them and the scale, not just in the units in Germany fighting those first echelons of the Soviet advance, but actually bringing all those reservists over from the United States, over from the UK, all the equipment being pre-positioned in situ in Germany as well, ready to go. And for example, I was on Reforger in the stay behind role, and I remember the OP we had out, and the first elements were coming through. And the method of report normally was you'd say T-55 or whatever, but in this case it was American kit. And it'd be M1 Abrahams again, and you'd be saying that for like 5 minutes. And then it would be Bradley again. And I remember one movement, we were sat there for about 2 hours constantly reporting equipment. That, to me, just shows you the scale of these exercises.
And the scale that would be if it did go wrong and the Western group of forces started moving offensively towards Western Germany. Yes, I've said this earlier. The size of the stay-behind strategic concept and the amount of troops that were obviously operating in that battle space surprised me from your paper.
Absolutely. The Allies, led by the US and the UK, developed this stay-behind concept as part of the war planning and assisted military units as well as civilian stay-behind organizations in standing up and taking on this role. When we're talking about special forces, by the way, I always make a point, we need to distinguish between the different kinds of special forces units that we have. On the one hand, the deep infiltration capable units like 22SS and the US Special Forces, these would have had a different role, not stay behind per se, but rather infiltrating deep behind enemy lines and strike strategic targets there. A special forces officer told me once that had they had the time, they would have had their missions deep in Czechoslovakia or in East Germany or even further. But if the Warsaw Pact had been able to attack without any prior warning to the West, then they would have just bombshelled, as he called it, and would have taken on a stay-behind role. So they also had a secondary stay-behind mission.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think everybody loves to be called Special Forces, and it's a catch-all, but our unit wasn't Special Forces. Like we used to say, we're not Special Forces, we're a specialist force, and there's a massive difference there, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And that includes 21 SAS, 23 SAS, and the other special observers units, and the other units which had a special role in this fierce, aggressive, delaying battle to fighting withdrawal to the main line of defense in the 50s, the River Rhine, and then progressively much closer to the inner German border. When we talk about stay-behind role, then the game was to enable NATO forces to retard the Warsaw Pact attack. But the planning went further in time and space, and there were clandestine networks of civilian stay-behinds that would have taken on a resistance role in occupied territories. For example, things like smuggling out downed pilots or agents in what was called red lines. And they would have assisted Western Allied special forces in infiltrating behind enemy lines to conduct sabotage missions. These things were trained up into the 80s, the late 80s, when the SBS conducted exercises where they would infiltrate Holland, guided by Dutch stay-behind agents, and then conduct their mission, like blowing up the locks on a harbor or something. So there's a wide bandwidth of roles and units in this special forces / stay-behind realm.
I think what you can see from Tamir's conversation there is there's two distinct strands developing. There was our role, which was digging in, remaining more or less static and carrying out deep strike. And the other stay behind was the training up of civilian forces, helping to maintain rat lines. And I've got a friend I've developed on Instagram who follows the Unconventional Soldier podcast. It's from Norway. And he sent me a couple of articles where they're renovating houses in Norway in the last 10 years. And they're turning up weapons, radios. And this is all part of the Norwegian stay-behind resistance that was going to be in effect. And these weapons and radios and that were still in situ. It's really amazing that it's still turning up 50 years later.
This ground was trodden during the Second World War with the resistance, airmen, intelligence feeding back, guiding people into targets, and then helping them extract as well as obviously conducting resistance operations themselves.
And let's not forget, countries like Norway had a tradition of this in World War II. The telemark raids, the rat runs for getting pilots. So this is only 30 years after the war, so the Norwegians had a proud tradition of resistance behind whilst being occupied, if you like.
And potentially we still have people who were the planners in those days during the Second World War, were still in service during the Cold War, who brought all that expertise to the table as well.
So that leads us nicely on to the next question then, because we've talked about the Second World War. Where did the concept of stay-behind units come from then, Tamir?
Well, in the Second World War, we saw the invention of long-range reconnaissance and special operations units, like the Long-Range Desert Group in North Africa, the SAS, the commandos, etc. on the military side. But just like Kev said, also the clandestine resistance and sabotage networks that were run by the SOE and the Americans. One unit, for example, MI9, was an SOE unit, which was specialized in exfiltration of pilots and agents from behind Nazi lines. This unit, after the Second World War, was turned into a military unit called the Joint Reserve Reconnaissance Unit, which later turned into 23 SAS for the role in the Northern Army Group in NATO in Stay Behind. Another direct link to the Second World War experience was, for example, the planning conducted by Major General Colin Gubbins of SOE fame, who later defined the role of a special operations branch and called for this special operations branch to train agents and personnel, make the appropriate contacts in foreign countries, and develop clandestine means of communication in order to undertake special operations as may be required by the theater commander. He wrote this in 1945, so already then they were thinking about the role of special forces, which had largely been disbanded after the Second World War, in the fight for Western Europe under NATO. This turned then into the basis for the creation of these special units and the stay-behind networks. As you mentioned, a lot of the former Allied countries under occupation, which had secret networks, continued again under the guidance of the ones who had guided them in the Second World War. As I mentioned, Norway, but also Holland, Belgium, France, etc., all had secret intelligence service and SAS support in building up and conducting these stay-behind networks and operations.
When you look at the Special Forces operations during the war, a lot of conventional army commanders look at Special Forces with some scepticism, and a lot of them actually didn't like them, and that contributed in some way to them being disbanded quite quickly after the Second World War. So what's amazed me is that they were able to get these units up and running quite quickly, and that scepticism seems to be put to one side. I was just wondering why you think that is. Was that because of the scale of the threat by the Soviet Union, or was there other reasons?
Well, possibly desperation, because the numerical superiority of the Warsaw Pact was such that nobody had any illusions that one could hold the advances on the Iron Curtain border. So I think anything that possibly could help in retarding and delaying the advance of the Warsaw Pact was welcomed. I think in the clandestine world, they just happen because they can happen without much political oversight. The US was fundamental in defining the concept and the role of stay-behind military and clandestine stay-behind for NATO. As far as we know, as I mentioned earlier, only US documents have been declassified. But they were quite early defining these roles in case of an all-out war.
We were a Royal Artillery stay-behind unit, and Kev and I, throughout the series we did initially about the creation of the unit and its history during the Cold War, what was plainly obvious from our own personal experience as young soldiers, and then talking to more senior people that we've had on the podcast, is the Royal Artillery did not like the idea of stay-behind OPs. They never fully embraced it because they're quite a traditional organisation, and we were always underfunded, under-resourced, and pretty much relied on the guile and the determination of the soldiers in the unit. So again, that's an interesting sort of dilemma that we faced, and it's interesting to see. I think sometimes the American army is far more forward-thinking in a lot of respects than the British, and I think that's probably played a part in it as well for the Americans.
I think they've embraced some of their experiences more. Like you say, end of the Second World War, we disbanded all unconventional or irregular kind of forces. We quickly moved to a peacetime, reducing the sizes, and got back to probably what would look like in 1939, before we had Churchill raising up the irregulars. We had the commandos then raised, and they were doing their raids. But these are small force multipliers, and some of it was going to be for strategic targets, some of it for morale as well, that we were hitting back, and probably politically showing the Americans that we were not out of the fight, to obviously from 1941 to draw the Americans in and then carry on that fight, and to show other people in Europe who were occupied that there was potentially some hope.
You can see the strategic focus, though, of the Americans quite clearly post-war, and that comes from a 1951 memorandum that Tamir writes about in his paper. Can you just go over that, Tamir, just so people get the idea of this razor-like focus that the Americans provided?
It is an interesting document, and as you said, it shows the strategic role that they envisioned. What the document gives is a clear mission statement, and I quote, "The utilization of covert operations to the fullest practicable extent to assist in accomplishing the military defeat of the USSR and her satellites. Highest priority among covert operations in support of military war plans will be given to the retardation of the Soviet advance in Western Europe." So a very clear mission. In the 1950s, the rebirth of these special units, also on the UK side. When in the 1950s, as I mentioned earlier, the plan was that the River Rhine would have been the main line of defense, the natural formidable obstacle, would have been the River Rhine, which is quite far to the west of West Germany's industrial heartland. Bonn, the West German capital, was on the River Rhine. It's the last big obstacle before you get to the strategically important port cities of Rotterdam, Zeebrugge, and Antwerp, which were needed to then conduct the reinforcement of the front line by American and UK forces. So there on the Rhine, the plan was to blow up the bridges and sink barges, etc., in order to make the river unfit for navigation for the Soviets. And this was done by turning to the small raids wing of the Royal Marines Amphibious School. Now, the small raids wing, that was the last remnant, minute remnant of a special forces capability in the Royal Navy. The school was ordered in 1950 to form a detachment and join the Royal Navy Rhine Flotilla. And that small detachment to the Rhine Flotilla was called the Special Boat Service, or Special Boat Squadron at the time. And so the SBS was reborn as part of BAOR. And their role would have been, after destroying the bridges, to then go out in light, Land Rovers or Jeeps, and two swimmer canoeists, operators as we would say today, of the SBS were the radio operator and the driver, and head east as far as possible, and then go underground and conduct stay-behind target acquisition. That was an interesting rebirth of a special forces capability.
And as we're witnessing in the Ukraine, The acquisition of targets in depth for strikes assets is a battle-winning capability. This isn't new. It was also recognised during the Cold War, wasn't it, Tamir?
Absolutely. And the battle over the years moved closer to the inner German border. And the role of stay-behind to facilitate those deep targeted strikes on Warsaw Pact, ammunition dumps, nuclear weapons, and so on and so forth was seen as crucial in order to really turn things around and not allow them to conduct this march to the River Rhine within days, as it was feared. Quite worryingly, the use of tactical nuclear weapons was a big part of that. And in order to stop the Warsaw Pact forces as far east as possible, there were plans for a demolition belt, a minefield belt, as it were, on West German soil, and thus prevent the Warsaw Pact forces from crossing, easily force them to conduct amphibious or bricklaying exercises.
It's interesting because you're starting to see a lot of these Cold War tactics coming into play again, and you can see that defensive line the Russians built in Ukraine. And we are talking about minefields. The Russians have built these 10 kilometres in depth over in Ukraine. The use of bomblet, but we've banned bomblet now, effectively. We've signed up to treaties that don't use it. Makes me laugh a little bit when you're reading about Ukraine and they're saying, oh, the Russians are doing this. But the Russians have always done that. And we seem to be getting caught out. They're actually doing it again. They've remembered it. We seem to have forgotten it.
I think you're right. We spoke about this before. We've forgotten about the old Soviet tactics hasn't really changed. It's mass artillery. The Soviet Union was always big on artillery. The Russians are big on artillery. We've all forgotten these lessons. We've moved away from some of those, let's call it old-fashioned, but it's not. Artillery is still the war winner on the battlefield. Deep strike. I mean, one thing that, listening to the conversation and looking at it, in our stay-behind role, we had quite a limited time frame because our artillery pieces didn't have that huge range, and we didn't have missile systems in the same way we've got today. So we would be reliant on air, but air defence in the Soviet Union was massive. Again, to get an aircraft through to take out a target would be quite difficult. So it was quite a difficult space for the stay-behind to bring strike assets to bear because of the range constraints of the time.
I think the listener needs to bear in mind as well, Kev, that we talk about strike because soldiers like to blow things up. Tamir knows this as well. We all like to blow things up. But vast majority of our job would have been intelligence gathering.
Yeah.
The follow-on units coming behind, identifying those capabilities. And we are very well trained in that you could recognise half a dozen vehicles, then your knowledge would then anticipate that formation that was coming through. Yeah. Whether it was a tank battalion, an infantry battalion, an NBC reconnaissance regiment, all that type of thing. So I think what we shouldn't lose in this is the intelligence gathering aspect.
So what you're saying is more long-range desert group than SAS raiding. Because long-range desert group in the Second World War, they did the road watch.
And you can't make films about that because it's
2 hours of boredom.
2 hours of boredom. It's dull, dirty, dangerous work. And that triumvirate, dull, dirty, dangerous, is what a lot of artificial intelligence and drone work, that sort of technical surveillance is doing now. Everybody likes to blow things up. Not everybody likes to sit in an OP for days on end, just observing. And it takes a lot of discipline to do that. It's
massive.
You two guys know as well from your own experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the moment, when I hear people recommending that Western special forces should teach the Ukrainians how to do stuff, I think it's the other way around. We'll be learning from the Ukrainians in years to come on how to use special operation forces, how to fight the Russians, and those important things.
And some of these things will be lessons we learned during the Second World War and beyond, but we've forgotten about because obviously we fight the war we're in, but we should never forget peer-to-peer armies, which we haven't really been scaled for a long time since the end of the Cold War. We forget those skills. We forget about the importance of air defence. We don't invest enough into it so we can have some kind of air protection. We've forgotten about artillery, the importance of massed artillery and its impact and effect, and the deep strike battle.
Yeah,
you know, you don't want to be fighting on the front line, infantry to infantry, but you want to be able to degrade the opposition well before they get to that point where the infantry is in range to engage that target. But you want to absolutely decimate them before that point, so then you can overwhelm them in the contact battle.
Yeah, and special forces are important to prepare that battlefield and degrade, as you said, the enemy's ability to hit you, to hit your infantry.
NATO's challenge then, Tamir, was to form these units to deliver the function. And interested in your thoughts on the creation of these units, the needs for them.
The creation of the units looks to me like directly linked to the situation on the ground, to the needs on the ground. As I said earlier, in the 50s, the main line of defense was a river. So you want to have swimmer canoeists, naval commandos doing that. Later on, as the main line of defense was moved closer to the German border, then you need specialized infantry for that, like the special observers. All of that, by the way, was tied into the war planning that obviously developed over the years in NATO. And the role of NATO also became more and more important in coordinating these efforts, which were warfighting efforts. So anything which is warfighting, be it militarily or clandestine efforts, they had to be coordinated at some level efforts. NATO then created working groups to do this coordination and consultation on the subject within NATO headquarters, and these were called the Clandestine Planning Committee. They discussed things like communications, radio frequencies. Guess what? It needs to be coordinated. Networks. Yeah, if you have a red line that crosses state lines, country borders, then you need to coordinate that. You need to train together. And there were exercises using military or involving military and clandestine assets in actual exercises to coordinate the activities during wartime. And you said it was a pretty crowded battlefield when it came to special units and stay behind. So NATO had the so-called Allied clandestine coordination groups, which were in the NATO commands in order to have a liaison, a point of contact with the clandestine side of things, in order to not step on each other's toes.
I think what's amazing about this is, and read your paper, it was very, very clear. That level of cooperation is mind-boggling when you look what's happening now with NATO and Ukraine, where they can't even get artillery shipments right. But for this concept, they were burrowing right down into that level of detail that was required. Puts what's happening in Ukraine in perspective in a lot of respects, I think.
And the secrecy that was around it as well. Because every
it was all
country,
kept quiet.
Yeah, because if you're saying Holland and you're building up this civilian stay behind concept organisation, Hyde, to assist with resistance, passage of pilots if your country's occupied.
And you can see that at the very low level, as I was referring to in Norway, where they're renovating houses and turning this stuff up, and it's remained secret to this day. It's amazing.
And even in our little world, we only knew of the UK elements. We knew a little bit about the Americans because we went to the LERP school together, so we understood the Belgians had a LERP unit, the Germans had the LERP unit, so we'd do a stay behind concept. But we didn't understand the scale, and we didn't understand what their roles were completely or what they were going to do.
2 points, though, we need to remember. The clandestine side was pretty quickly taken out of the realm of NATO and NATO military commanders. I think in the early 60s, they already said that this was a role which was taken care of by clandestine intelligence services, and thus a national responsibility, and not something that NATO should get involved in. The coordination of efforts, yes, but not the actual clandestine networks, how they were stood up, who was members in those networks, so on and so forth. That's number one. The secrecy, unfortunately, in 1961, a East German Stasi officer wrote a book, like a propaganda book, on these sabotage troops that were these silent killers that were stood up, that were fighting for NATO, and that were stood up in West Germany, trained as rangers in southern Germany, referring to 10th Group, Special Forces. So they did know about the concept, they did know about those units. How far they had infiltrated potentially these units is not known. But the Eastern Bloc intelligence service were aware of these things.
I suppose we shouldn't forget as well that the Soviets themselves had a lot of experience from the Second World War of running operations behind German lines deep within the Soviet Union, and they actually tied up a lot of German troops fighting these resistance armies as well. So the Soviets would have had a degree of experience in stay-behind operations, though they probably wouldn't have recognised them as such at that time.
Yeah, the whole partisan field in the Second World War obviously was only in part run by the West and the others by the Soviet Union. Indeed.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the European units and the American units as well.
As mentioned earlier, we had the Special Boats Squadron on the Rhine, but we also had the rebirth of the SAS. 21 SAS was reborn with that role in mind for BAOR as a reserve unit, and later 23 SAS. So those units would have to have been mobilized from the UK, from the reservists, so from the UK, and then deployed to one British corps within 48 hours of a warning that the Warsaw Pact was about to attack. The time to deploy these units was a worry for British commanders of the Northern Army Group, as 48 hours is a long time when it comes to a surprise attack by the Warsaw Pact. To fill the gap, a generic BAOR unit was needed, and in 1962, the Special Reconnaissance Squadron of the Royal Armoured Corps was stood up, and they were in that role till 1964, providing intelligence, target acquisition, so on and so forth. After that, the Honourable Artillery Company became a surveillance and target acquisition patrol regiment in the early 70s, alongside, again, 21 and 23 SAS. And only in 1982, a regular army unit, actually a former unit, the Special Observation Post troops, were tasked with the role as part of, I think, 5th Regiment Royal Artillery.
That's correct, yeah.
Stationed in Hildesheim, so that's pretty close to the inner German border. So the way to the pre-prepared heights would have been rather short compared to having to come from Birmingham, where one of the SAS reservist units would have been stationed. The other allies, and now I'm talking just about Northak, the Northern Army Group in northern West Germany. For example, the Belgians created a unit in 1955, which was attached to the 1st Belgian Corps in Germany. It was the Escadron Spécial de Recherche, SOE-ESR, which was made up of army and paracommando detachments and also stationed in Germany. Later, it became the first company, or Première Compagnie d'Équipe Spéciale de Reconnaissance, first Special Reconnaissance Group. The Germans created their LRP units from 1963 onwards, the Fernspeer. So each German army corps would have had a company of long-range reconnaissance troops in that role. The German Navy created special operations capabilities in the 50s. The combat divers, the Kampfschwimmer, were assigned wartime targets in the GDR. Since 1961, the Dutch had 3 commando companies called Observer Scouts stationed in Herne. And later, the 104th Observation and Reconnaissance Company. It was a constant development of new units and better suited units. The French had a unit, the 7th Compagnie de Commando, under a parachute regiment, the 13th Regiment of Parachute Dragoons, and also stationed in southwest Germany.
Tamir, just to jump in, I'm quite interested in asking you about the German experience, because the German army, or the German forces in World War II, didn't really indulge much in special forces. They had Otto Skorzeny, who made the famous glider raid to free Mussolini, and obviously one of the first militaries to adopt parachutists. But am I right in saying there was no real German version of the SAS, that type of thing, mainly because of the type of warfare that they were fighting the British with and the other allies? In your research and with your own military background, was there any sort of scepticism in the post-war about raising a specialist unit? Was it seen as I'm trying to think of the right word here. Was it seen as a bad thing to do, or was the concept embraced quite fully?
Well, the Germans did have the Division Brandenburg in the Second World War, which was a special operations unit. But there are not many operations, have become famous. So that is quite true. Anything in Germany, and especially also during immediately after the Second World War and in the Cold War, anything special or elitist was obviously frowned upon. So the formation of those units, I think, pretty much went unnoticed. It did not become a big issue that I could discern in my research. Obviously, then in the 70s and 80s, anything in uniform was despised by many young pacifist Germans.
It was interesting that the Royal Army Corps stood up a specialist or stay-behind unit, selected them, trained them, but they only lasted 2 years. And I've not been able to find any reason why such a capability, which was obviously being developed across the whole of Europe. And although we had 3 reserve units in the UK who were going to deliver that function, because of the time challenges of getting from the UK to Western Germany, why on earth you get rid of the only regular component who could push out almost immediately into deep battle space and actually buy the reservist time to get forward, grab their equipment and start moving forward as well?
I think from stuff I've read, the squadron only lasted 2 years because the role was passed on in its entirety to 2-3 SAS. And reading in the background, I get the impression that the senior element of the Royal Armoured Corps didn't think this was a role that they should be wasting good soldiers on.
Sounds familiar.
So personnel from that squadron in Cyclops Squadron 2 RTR provided cadres from whom personnel were drawn to establish the Parachute Squadron Royal Armoured Corps in 1965. And this was the first squadron from the Royal Armoured Corps to serve in airborne forces since the disbandment of 16th Airborne Division. But when you also read into the background of that squadron, it's quite uncanny in that the selection procedures, the tactics and techniques that they used were very, very similar to what we in 473 Battery, the then Special OP Troop, used in our role.
Fair.
So one of the things we've got, Tamir, is all these different units all forming. So around about 1979, it was decided to bring all this knowledge into a central place and form a training unit. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think you actually had a podcast on that, on the NATO's International Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol School, which was founded in Weingarten, southern Germany. UK was the lead nation in the beginning. And there, as you mentioned, the different units, SAS, the German Fanspeer, Dutch Marines, Belgian Paracommandos, the US Special Forces and others worked and trained together on a daily basis. The courses, as you well remember, included long-range reconnaissance, obviously, then combat survival, the much-loved E&E, escape and evasion course with a very comfortable wool coat and hobnail boots, and resistance to interrogation, which was the all-time favorite. Advanced Warsaw Pact specialist recognition skills. You mentioned earlier the old role of road watch, and to be able to predict what is going to be coming after you saw the first command vehicle and the stuff with the antennas on top, that something important is coming your way. But also CQB, close quarter battle courses. So yeah, that was actually the first time that the units could train together and not only on a bilateral basis exchange best practices, but do it in an organized fashion. There were also LERB exercises called TriStar, originally sponsored by the SAS, and it was an annual exercise.
From my perspective, and I think Kev will be in agreement here, going to the LERB school for me was a real eye-opener. I think it was a really forward-thinking organisation for the time, and the British Army could not replicate anything like that. You had all these Special Forces instructors. Some of them had been in Vietnam. For example, I did the LERP medics course, and the medic that took us was a Vietnam veteran, and he was teaching us things down there that the British Army would never even consider teaching you. You know, how to put in, at the time, how to put in IVs, give injections, use of tourniquets, which is standard practice in the British Army now, but was actually hugely controversial back in the 80s. And we cover a lot of this in 2 podcast episodes, number 5 and 49. But I'd just like to give a couple little bits, if you like, little vignettes of tasters for those episodes, because I think they summarise what the LERP school was like. And the first one was, I had a friend of mine who was down there on the CQB course, and they're doing all the CQB, and there's all these nations there. And bear in mind, this is the late 1980s, there was not a lot of the wars going on in the background that NATO countries were involved in. So the SAS instructor looks at his students and he puts out the question, has anybody here been in a firefight? As if everybody's looking round, and this Italian soldier puts up his hand, and everybody looks at this small Italian soldier, and the SS instructor goes, "Oh, okay, where?" And he went, "About half a dozen times with the mafia in support of the Carabinieri." And I think as a young soldier, you're very, very arrogant, and it comes down to never look at people and take them as face value. And there's a few other stories, not that kids got a few, but I think it was great for breaking down barriers, learning different things from people, and it was a great, great experience. Everybody loved going to school, didn't they, Kev?
I'd say not only did we have some of the most experienced instructors, but the students as well. Massive experience. You obviously mixed teams, mixed nations. And when I did my escape and evasion course, the Hunter Force was GSG9. It gives them a training ground as well, and they are not very nice people either, may I say. They knew what they were doing, but they were practicing anti-terrorism skills on us on the run in Germany, and they employed all of their assets. They didn't hold back. They treated it as real as they were allowed to legally treat it as well. So we benefited because we had a very proactive Hunter Force. But you don't get no better than them coming after you, unfortunately, which is not what sometimes you want a little bit of an easier run. But also, I was with students that had tremendous amount of experience as well as the instructors. To replicate that today would be quite difficult, but it was probably one of the most forward-leaning international training schools in the world. And we were very lucky to get onto those courses.
Yeah, indeed. And it shows you two things. That the Allies agreed on the importance of these skills. Across the alliance, you had those kind of units, and so they agreed on the importance of training together. And B, what you mentioned with the GSG9, using all their technical and other abilities to find you, to hunt you down and find you, was excellent training, because the Soviet Union would have done exactly the same, and with a lot of vigor and without, as you said, they wouldn't have any legal impediments to their methods of trying to find you and then getting information out of you. So it's hugely important.
And what we discussed on one of the episodes about when you were sighting your OPs, oftentimes you'd pick the third best position, because even though the first position might offer an optimal view, MD doing a map and ground appreciation study from the Soviet side would go, that's where I'd put an OP. So you had to be second-guessing the opposition who'd be hunting you down. And a lot of that was taught to you on the LERP school as well, about how the Soviets conducted roadside searches, and all that had to be taken into account and learned. So, yeah, it was all really interesting stuff.
Alongside the military stay-behind units, and obviously we talked about some of the special forces units, the area that really interested me, and you mentioned it earlier, was the civilian clandestine, if I can say that word, stay behind clandestine. That's stay behind organisations. So, can you take us through a little bit about those sort of organisations?
I mean, the civilian intelligence agency run side of things was envisioned quite early. When it comes to BAOR, the commander-in-chief of the British Army of the Rhine said in 1952, that was General Sir John Harding. In 1952, he called for the creation of a German-manned stay-behind sabotage organization. And we can but assume that this actually happened. Unfortunately, none of the documents have been declassified. So it was the intelligence services, the British and the Americans, that assisted states to build up these clandestine organizations, or stood up equivalent organizations in their occupation zones. We must remember that Germany was occupied, and that the northern Germany was the British occupation zone, and where the Brits and apparently also the Dutch and Danish stood up civilian stay-behind organizations. The running of these stay-behind organizations was coordinated with, as was then called, the Organisation Gehlen, which later became the German Federal Intelligence Agency, the Nachrichtendienst. In 1956, then the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the German intelligence agency, took over these networks and merged them into one organization. And that was called, and now that's an earful, the Lehr- und Ausbildungsgruppe für das Fernspähwesen der Bundeswehr. So the Teaching and Training Group for the Special Reconnaissance Units of the German Army.
German is such an evocative language. It's fantastic.
It rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? So, yeah, beautiful. But if you want to confuse the enemy, then you find a name like this, and German actually has form for that. That's true. The training of these units in northern Germany would have been conducted by the Special Intelligence Service, MI6, and the SAS. And we know that, for example, from Swiss documents, from Swiss Commission of Inquiry into the Swiss stay-behind organization, where they clearly describe how their agents were trained in Fort Moncton, the SAS and SIS training facility. And they would have been trained in aerial resupply, signals, escape and evasion, parachuting, demolitions.
And all this would have been familiar to any French resistance fighter during the Second World War, wouldn't it? It's eerily familiar.
To be sure, the civilian stay-behind organizations would have had a marginal role in the first phase of a conflict, of a war. Their role then would have been to just survive, to lay low and survive, and hopefully not be discovered already, be on some sort of Soviet list of stay-behind agents which were already identified. They would have come into play in the later stages during occupation. Mentioned earlier, the role in assisting deep penetration special forces units like the SAS, the SBS, and so forth, in infiltrating occupied territories to conduct demolition and other tasks. But also in a much later stage of the war, i.e. when NATO was actually poised to reoccupy, to reconquer the territories it would have lost in the first onslaught. And in that phase, they would have kind of blown their cover and quite literally blown their cover in conducting sabotage and demolition.
These would have been more or less sleeper cells until they received an activation signal. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And that and the role in being the local point of contact potentially for deep infiltration units like the SAS. So they trained with the SAS. Mind you, SAS finished that cooperation in the early 80s because they did not see the need for amateurs, as they would call them, to assist in their missions. And it was just considered a security risk. You know, their cover might have been already blown and so on and so forth. The Soviet Union as an occupational power, and we see that again in Ukraine today, is not the nicest occupation power that you can hope for. And a ruthless authoritarian state at home, they wouldn't have no inhibitions in torturing and getting the information and breaking up networks, finding agents, etc., sleeper agents or others, with all means possible.
We talked about earlier that obviously the Soviet Union, the Western group of forces, had found out in the 60s about the stay-behind concept, and obviously that was going to be used. So what was their countermeasures?
Well, as Colin mentioned earlier, they obviously would have had their tactics of searching the hides of stay-behind observation posts, and they would have had exactly what was used in exercises by the British Army, and that is, the Mark I K9 dog, and which proved to be the best means of finding hides and finding hidden troops. The infamous exercise Badger's Lair in Soltau training area in 1973, where apparently 37 out of 39 hides by 2-3 SAS were discovered within hours. So there was that. And that was with dogs, and not elite forces like GSG-9 or the KGB military GRU forces, but I think Royal Air Force with dogs.
I think I can add a couple of comments from background reading I've been doing, in that there's two concepts using dig-in Mexi shelters. In the early 70s, 2-1 and 2-3 were using the whole Mexi shelter on the forward edge of a wood line. And it's a massive shelter, it takes a huge amount of digging in. Your chances of getting away with digging it in the first place are very, very slim, I would argue. Secondly, is the other concept that we adopted straight away in 1982, was whereby you dug in the large Mexi shelter hide deep in a wood and then deployed hundreds of meters forward your 2 satellite OPs. And an OP, for a civilian listener might not know, it'd be like a slit trench, 4 or 5 feet deep, probably about 6 or 8 feet long, and it'd hold 2 men. So that would be far easier to hide than a large Mexi shelter. The other problem they had, and still endures even if you do this concept today, would be signals. Because at the time you're using HF, which required you to get out the main hide and set up a various array of antennas. So that would expose you out in the ground. The other problem you got is the Soviet Union had, back then, and still has now, very good signal intelligence capability, i.e. the ability to detect signals that have been sent out. So I think that was part of the reason that as the 70s moved on, 2.1 and 2.3 in the HAC moved away from that first concept of having the large hide on the forward edge of the wood and moving the hide into the deep in the wood and have 2 satellite OPs.
I think the other weakness for them was they did pre-positioned, because obviously the time frame of getting from the UK to in-country, you'd have to have the hides already put in place. One of our strengths was we didn't. So we had the ability to have an area of operation, so we could put the hide, the Mexi hide, where we deemed it was the right place to put it, and we're putting it in straight away. It'd take 24, 48 hours, but it was fresh. No one knew it was there before, because obviously the big thing that people forget about, the espionage threat during the Cold War in West Germany with SOXMIS, which is obviously the Soviet version of BRIXMIS, and other people, West Germans that were working for the Eastern Group as well, who would spot defensive equipment, spot pre-positioned hides. All this information was weaknesses, and espionage was the Cold War campaign, and all the information was getting fed in. What and I think our strength was, until we loaded up the vehicle and then we drove out and then resighted it, no one knew exactly where we were going to put it until we put it in. They knew the area of operation, but not the exact point.
But I tell you what, if you go on the Imperial War Museum website, there's a very good video there of, it's either 2.1 or 2.3 SS digging in a Mexi, and it looks quite amateurish. It wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes. It's on top of a railway embankment. The sign would have been huge. You know, again, we were digging these things deep in woods. We would wrap sandbags round trees to stop spoil, bits of sand clinging to the bark. We didn't go around with brushes and brush that sign off.
Yeah,
we gave briefings to officers, and we'd bring them into the wood and to say to them, right, we're about to go forward to the OP. And then at the end of the briefing, before we moved to the OP, the hatch would pop up literally 1 foot from them. And the guy would come out from this huge underground Mexi shelter. Then we'd take them underground. And they couldn't believe that we were able to conceal that hide in the woods. And again, on exercises like Reforger, we often had the enemy occupying the wood we were in, tanks parked around the Mexis, people patrolling past the OPs on the wood line doing clearance patrols, and we were never found. So I think a lot of it is down to the skill of the unit, and that's why a lot of the reservist units like the TA were found a bit wanting, because in order to get these skills honed, you have to practice them time and time again.
Absolutely, and local knowledge is highly important.
Absolutely. Sorry to harp on here, but I must have dug in 7 or 8 Mexis, and we only get compromised once, and that was by a local forest meister who came upon us. And we were trying our pidgin German, his pidgin English to communicate, but I could tell he was pretty angry. And we told him we'd return it to normal. And just as we said that, this large tree slipped into the hole at a diagonal angle. He was. I understood German quite well, because the international language of swearing and being angry is quite good. But I digress. So another question for you then, Tamir. What was the type of equipment used, and what were the methods employed?
Well, you already mentioned the Mexi shelter, which is a modular system. Once you've dug a deep hole, then could build a frame which would then hold the soil that you cover it with. So that was particular and special for this role. obviously, we need to remember this was the time of wet film and analog and Morse code and communications like that, which obviously today we have technical abilities far beyond what was at the time. And actually, signals was a big part of the civilian stay-behind organization. The use of a radio which was developed in the early 50s, the RS-6, which was developed by the CIA for agents abroad and built by Motorola. That was an analog system. The Germans then developed a cryptographically protected digital system which conveyed data and not by Morse, called the Harpoon. And that was then ordered as the means of communication for the civilian stay-behind assets. It was introduced in 1991, which was a bit late to be of any use. But the capabilities then were much better. I mean, sending digitally encrypted messages over a distance of more than 6,000 kilometers. So that's pretty good. But that came really late. And everything before that we know and that were found in equipment caches was much more primitive. They're talking about equipment found in caches, and there have been quite a few, and already from the 50s, but into the 90s, the Brits apparently informed West German authorities of a cache in Grunwald Forest in the British zone of Berlin. Then when the police then dug it out, they found 9mm pistols and ammunition, knives, navigation equipment, the before-mentioned RS-6 spy radio, manuals, tank and aircraft recognition books, a flask of brandy, very civilized, chocolate, and a copy of Total Resistance, the famous or infamous guerrilla warfare manual written in the 1950s by a Swiss major. In British occupation zone of Austria, before Austria regained sovereignty, they found Sten submachine guns, FN high-power pistols, and plastic explosives, and so on. So you see, that's pretty much the classic World War II SOE agent stuff, really. On a different level, I actually found in my research the reference to a training handbook on nuclear warfare by the CIA's Nuclear Energy Division. And that was written in the 1950s, or the document where I saw a reference to it. I haven't seen the actual document. Has not been declassified. But this handbook was written in such a way, this is how it's described in the document that I saw. It was written in such a way that its classification would not prevent its passage to foreign clandestine services or foreign nationals, including stay-behind organizations. So apparently what was described in that manual was how to do damage assessment after a nuclear strike, things like this. Hugely important. You know, you strike a target and then you have to do the damage assessment. So stay-behind organizations were also trained in that sort of warfare, which I found quite interesting.
I wouldn't have liked to have been walking up to a site that's just been nuclear attacked, glowing away.
Training battle damage assessments for conventional warfare is fine. I think battle damage assessment for nuclear warfare, yes, there's nothing else there.
Other exotic equipments, if you ask about equipment, were cache locators. So if you can't remember where you buried your stuff, then you need a cache locator, apparently. Then electronic devices to pinpoint prepositions, weapons, and equipment storage sites. A battery charger that could be run on anything from petroleum to coal and twigs. One US publication, which is still classified, is called the Guerrilla Warfare Guide, which probably makes for an interesting read. So all these clandestine means and tactics had stay-behind organizations in mind from the very beginning and until the end.
I'm interested to hear about the cache locator, because our cache locator was you get a cache report, and then it would be a sketch map and a compass bearing from a known point, and then a bit of string that you ran out on that compass bearing to direct you to the cache. Yeah. So, as ever, the British were doing it on the cheap.
Yeah. Many a time I spent the night hoping that the string was not cut and digging around and trying to find a cache.
don't underestimate the length that the Americans will go through to find different solutions to replace the good old Mark I string.
Fashioned ways.
I think it's interesting because I think from our experiences, obviously we had the Mexis, we had some other bits of equipment, but there was nothing really fancy. Our radios were good, but they were as good as at the time. Me and Colin, when we first started to use the radio and the burst transmission equipment, we were still using OTP or one times pad from the Second World War. There was no real fancy equipment for us. It was reusing or re-employing other equipment. Stretchers were used as beds, and the filtration units somebody had made up in his shed somewhere for the Mexi. I don't think the British invested in the same amount of money as the Americans may have invested in both the military side or the civilian clandestine side.
I think there's two aspects to that. Firstly is the lack of interest that the Royal Artillery showed in our role, but also in the early 1980s, the equipment hadn't moved on that much. We talked about the Falklands War. I've done a few episodes on the Falklands War. The Falklands War was fought on air, land and sea, and it would have been recognisable to World War II soldiers. So I think part of it is a lack of interest in funding, but also that technology just wasn't there in a lot of cases. Tamir, you mentioned that in the early tactics of delaying the Soviets was fighting that battle with the Rhine as a blocking position, if you like. And obviously there was a lot of bridges across the Rhine, and many of them had mouse holes in them for ease of placing demolitions in the right place to destroy them. But what other sort of preparations were put in place at this time?
A lot of preparations were made to facilitate these demolitions. So over every autobahn and every bridge, over every river in Germany had these mouse holes. Till the 70s, the mouse holes were of the size and shape that you can actually put a SADEM, a special atomic demolition munition inside. Pre-positioned under American ownership, obviously, but then released to the theater commander when he or she saw fit. They would have been charged and made ready for explosion by so-called Sprengmeister, so the demolition experts or combat engineers, or indeed Bundeswehr reservists who served in territorial defense units, and their role would have been to facilitate the demolition of these bridges. The special atomic demolition unit, the suitcase bomb or the backpack bomb, as they're sometimes called, they would have been handled by American special forces in Germany or handed over for use by potentially British forces under nuclear sharing agreements and provisions. So just like nuclear bombs that were air delivered, allies like the Netherlands and Germany and others did have access to American nuclear weapons under nuclear sharing agreements in NATO. This holds true with the nuclear demolition belt that they were planning to use until the 1970s, when the German government started to get a bit worried about the use of nuclear weapons on German soil.
We talked about in a couple of episodes, Kev mentioned that when he first joined up, he was on the M109 and they had one nuclear gun per battery. And it's really amazing. We're just having this casual conversation this morning. We're talking about suitcase nuclear bombs and the casual use of nuclear weapons. You said in the 70s the Germans were starting to kick back. How did that manifest itself?
They certainly were not happy. There was changes of government. The governments in the first decades of the Cold War were more conservative governments, and then in the 70s the Social Democrats took over. And I think it was Chancellor Schmidt who then kicked back and stopped this policy that had been enacted of early release to theater commanders of nuclear weapons. In the 70s and 80s, no use of nuclear weapons on German soil would have been conducted without a German government decision. You might remember that the German army was constantly pushing to carry the fight further east or as far east as possible. And this one tank commander once told me that they would actually go, as he said, blitzkrieg on the Red Land forces in NATO exercises, taking the fight, none of that retreating and delaying battle, but actually going blitzkrieg on them and charging forward in order to take the fight, ideally, into East Germany.
And you saw that sea change in sort of the early to mid-80s from the British as well, where the manoeuvrist theory was brought into practice, and that was, as you say, not hold them at the Rhine, but actually engage them as far forward on the inner-German border as possible, where our OPs would have been put out, and then using manoeuvre warfare in order to take the fight forward. There's probably a political aspect to that as well, assuaging German concerns that their country wouldn't be turned into a nuclear wasteland.
Absolutely, yeah.
So obviously Colin and I are biased about the role of the stay-behind forces, especially from our unit perspective. So my question to you, based on your research and study, was the stay-behind concept and all the effort invested into it by all the nations a sound plan, or was it a very risky warfighting tactic without much or any hope of success? And my second part to this question is it still viable today, especially in a peer-to-peer campaign in the European theatre?
So, obviously, we don't really know. We have massively overestimated Russian capabilities in the all-out attack on Ukraine and the failure of the Battle of Kiev. But we also have overestimated Soviet Union war-fighting abilities during the Cold War. Having said this, it was and it still is a very risky war-fighting tactic. It would have hinged on the ability of the units to evade countermeasures that the Soviets would have taken. And having said this, we must also remember that every little helps in this war. And to tie up forces searching for stay-behind posts is already tying up forces which are not war-fighting, which are searching for stay-behind. You ask about the relevance in a peer-to-peer all-out war in Europe. Well, first of all, I don't think that there's any appetite on the Russian side to attack NATO. They know they can't win that. But having said this, in an age of hybrid attacks and where deniability of a transgression and a covert attack, a degrading of national sovereignty of a NATO state, so the deniability of such actions is paramount. It actually becomes the center of gravity of such an attack. What do I want to say by that? A challenge to Article 5 nowadays, i.e. if the Russians would choose to put boots on the ground in a way which is deniable, which little green men, maybe on Svalbard, on Spitsbergen in the Arctic Sea, or in northern Finland. And it's not commonly understood that this is actually an infringement on NATO territory. If the commonly accepted informational picture is not complete or as complete as can be, then the deniability will be high for the Russian side. The ability of the state involved, be it in the Baltics or in the High North or wherever, the ability to convince the allies that actually Russia has invaded NATO territory would become very difficult indeed. And if that challenge to Article 5 is seen as such by the state concerned, but not by others, and nothing follows, then this could be a potential death stroke to NATO, because the raison d'etre of NATO is to stand by its allies in an Article 5 situation. So here I see the relevance of actual eyes on target, on specialized units, on special forces, to actually bring that proof of infringement of sovereign territory, of NATO territory, to the North Atlantic Council, where they then would be able to decide in consensus that this was an attack on NATO and we have to respond. That's why I see it first and foremost and most likely to occur. In an all-out peer-against-peer war, the same would apply as it did in the Cold War. It would be a risky war-fighting technique with the known ability of the Russians when it comes to signals, intelligence, and electronic warfare, on the one hand. But on the other hand, we also see from Ukraine that the deep strikes, more often than not, there are HIMARS strikes which appear to come out of nowhere and on really high-value targets. So we assume that all of this is because of drone surveillance and for obvious reasons do not hear about the role of partisans behind Russian lines Ukrainian partisans, Ukrainian special forces, actually conducting that target acquisition and passing on that intelligence that facilitates these strikes. So I think it's highly relevant. I think it's being used right now in the war in Ukraine. And I think we should also prepare to use it in a future conflict, in a future war, before a future conflict, and before the conflict can become the war, and obviously in the war.
We've referred at a number of occasions on this podcast about relearning lessons from the Cold War, and you alluded to that grey zone warfare that the Russians have practiced. And we saw that in 2014 as well, that plausible deniability. Are they Russian soldiers? Are they not? And grey zone warfare for the Russians isn't new. It used to be called Maskirovka, doesn't it? And I forget the English translation of that, but it's about disguising things and leading your foe down a garden path, if you like. So again, that's something that's being learned. And I think you're right. I think we need to learn to operate in that grey zone in order to counter those Russian forces in there as well.
I mean, leading on from that, in podcast 45 of The Unconventional Soldier, Con and I discussed whether or not we thought the stay behind concept could be used in Ukraine, and we talked about some other elements about Ukraine. You'll have to listen to that one when you've got a spare minute or two.
If this has whetted your appetite for more information about stay behind operations, then you really need to listen to episodes 2 to 6, where Kev and I discuss the history of our own stay behind unit, the Special OP Troop, which then became 473 Special OP Battery, from its inception in 1982. And it's a complete history of the battery that finishes just before the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Well, that's it for another episode. And a huge thank you for Tamir for bringing his expertise, his fascinating story. As listeners know, the Stay Behind role is where me and Colin started our long and now historic military journey. But thank you, Tamir, for bringing the bigger picture to us and for the listeners. So we look forward to our next episode on the 7 Minutes to Midnight. This is where we'll look at the Korean War, which was one of the many proxy wars between the West and communism. So please do tune in. Remember to keep supporting The Unconventional Soldier. You can find us on all the usual suspects, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube and Twitter. If you downloaded us from iTunes and liked the podcast, it'd be great for you to leave us a review. A good review, obviously. If it's a bad review, there are plenty of other podcasts out there for you to listen to.
5 stars only.
Yes, please. Not the 4.5 that we had off somebody, but we won't mention no more names. And thanks again to Nick Beale for his continuing support and sponsorship to this series and offering technical support through his company, ISARR.